Moments that change the political conversation do not always arrive with a roar. Sometimes they slip into the world disguised as a joke, only to reveal themselves as a lesson. One such moment unfolded on a late-night stage in Hollywood, beneath the glow of studio lights and the hum of a crowd, expecting nothing more than laughter. The host had his cue cards. The cameras were already rolling, and the audience was trained to clap on command. But what they witnessed was something else entirely. When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked onto that stage, she did not carry the props of entertainment. She carried herself. Black heels, clicking like punctuation marks, an emerald blazer sharp against the backdrop, and hair coiled in a crown that did not move with the air. She was not there to be reduced to a punchline. She was there to embody every woman who had been told to smile when she wanted to speak, to soften when she needed to stand tall. Jimmy Kimmel leaned back in his chair, grinning. The grin he often wore when a politician sat across from him. He teased her with nicknames, called her fiery, hinted at her reputation for being combative. The crowd chuckled the way people do when they are not sure whether the joke lands or cuts. Then came the line. Meant to draw bigger laughter. He described her as spicy, suggesting that she carried herself less like a lawmaker and more like a reality television character. That was when Jasmine Crockett shifted the air. She did not laugh. She did not flinch. She lifted the studio mug, took a measured sip of water, and placed it back on the table with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly what was coming. Then, with a voice warm yet unyielding, she asked, "You ever get tired of white men calling you spicy just because you will not let them talk over you?" The room froze. The laughter fell away, like it had never belonged. In that pause, every person, whether seated in the studio or watching from their living room, felt the ground tilt beneath their expectations. This was no longer a comedy segment. It was an unmasking, a reminder that words, when chosen with care, can shake a space more forcefully than any outburst. It was not anger that silenced the room. It was dignity. It was history speaking through one woman who refused to wear a label designed to belittle. For centuries, Black women in America have been dressed in the same dismissive words: angry, bitter, loud, difficult. But Jasmine Crockett did something rare. She returned the word, not with heat, but with clarity. She transformed what was meant to box her into a mirror held up to power. That night, entertainment collided with truth. The world saw what it looks like when a Black congresswoman refuses to perform softness in order to be respected. She did not need volume. She did not need theatrics. She needed only one sentence. And in that sentence, she carried not just her own journey from East Dallas to Capitol Hill, but the memory of every ancestor who had been told to keep quiet in classrooms, in churches, in workplaces. This story is not about a viral clip, though the internet lit up with it. It is not about Jimmy Kimmel's stumble, though he found himself lost for words. This story is about presence. It is about what happens when one woman, rooted in truth, chooses not to bend her voice to fit someone else's comfort. Jasmine Crockett did not come to entertain. She came to remind us that justice sometimes arrives softly, spoken with composure, but powerful enough to rearrange the air in a room. Stay with us, because this is not just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and walk with us, because this time a Black voice will not be interrupted. Every story worth telling has roots, and the story of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is no different. To understand why one sentence on a late-night stage could move an entire nation, we must return to the soil from which her voice grew. That soil is layered with centuries of weight, history both spoken and unspoken, names both honored and erased, promises both made and broken. For generations, Black women in America have been marked with labels designed not to describe them, but to diminish them. Words like angry, fiery, too much, or spicy were never compliments. They were shackles, dressed as jokes. They were weapons cloaked in laughter. These words followed women into schools, into workplaces, into courtrooms, and into the halls of Congress. They reminded black women that their truth was always being measured against someone else's comfort. The history is not distant. It echoes in the Constitution that once counted black bodies as 3/5 of a human being. It lingers in the voices that told Sojourner Truth she should not speak. In the buses, where Rosa Parks was told to move. In the chambers where Shirley Chisholm was told she did not belong. Each generation of black women inherited the same battlefield: to speak without being silenced, to stand without being reduced. Jasmine Crockett was born into this inheritance. East Dallas was no stranger to struggle. Her mother worked nights as a nurse. Her father kept a small auto shop open longer than he could afford. Money was short. Time was shorter. But in that house, there was always room for questions. Young Jasmine was the child who raised her hand too often in class, the one who wanted to know why the library shelves were bare of black authors, why the textbooks skipped over Haiti, Ghana, and South Africa, why America's stories seemed to be written in a single color. Teachers called her difficult. She learned early that curiosity carried a price. By the time she reached Prairie View A&M, Jasmine's voice had sharpened. Debate halls became her battlefield. She faced students with more polish, more resources, and more connections. But she discovered that precision of thought could cut deeper than pedigree. Her words did not stumble. They landed, and every time someone tried to outtalk her, she leaned into the silence that followed. It was there. She found her power, not in being louder, but in being undeniable. Law school hardened those instincts. She stepped into the world of public defense, where injustice was not theoretical. It was written on the faces of mothers who could not afford bail. Fathers held longer than the law allowed. Children shuffled through a system built to forget them. In courtrooms, she was called aggressive for objecting too firmly, too emotional for defending too passionately. Every word became a label. Every sentence became a test. Yet every case also became a lesson. The system feared not the shout, but the truth spoken with clarity. This is the context that shaped Jasmine Crockett long before she stepped into Congress, long before she sat across from Jimmy Kimmel. She was not merely reacting to one joke about being spicy. She was answering centuries of dismissal. Her sentence carried the weight of Sojourner's question, Rosa's refusal, Shirley's campaign. It was not a clapback. It was a continuation. The roots of her story stretch further still back to Africa, where the ancestors of millions were taken, stripped of voice and name, forced into silence, yet even in chains. Words survived in song, in prayer, in whispers, passed from generation to generation. That survival was not passive. It was defiance. To speak at all was to resist. To hold on to truth was to hold on to dignity. Jasmine Crockett belongs to that lineage. So when a late-night comedian thought he was making light of her, he was stepping into a story much larger than his cue cards. He was brushing against a history where black women had always been asked to shrink in order to fit someone else's narrative. Jasmine chose not to shrink. She chose to stand within that history, carrying it with the grace of someone who knows that silence, when used with precision, can be the loudest weapon of all. And yet, Jasmine's presence in Congress is itself a victory carved out of centuries of exclusion. For most of American history, black voices in Congress were rare, fragile, and easily dismissed. Shirley Chisholm had to fight for a seat at the table. Barbara Jordan spoke in a chamber where her very presence unsettled the old order. Maxine Waters became a constant target, simply because she dared to be direct. Jasmine Crockett stepped into that same lineage, not as an exception, but as a continuation of a tradition that refused to vanish. For those over 60 watching at home, many of them African American elders, the recognition was instant. They had lived long enough to remember the sting of coded words, the tightrope of being outspoken without being branded angry. They had seen their sisters, daughters, and wives forced to hide their fire just to survive. And in Jasmine Crockett, they saw an echo of themselves. someone who did not bow her head, but raised it high enough to let the world see her. The connection did not stop at America's shores. Across the Atlantic, in Lagos, Accra, and Johannesburg, women who had fought their own battles against colonial systems watched the clip and nodded. The struggle for dignity is not bounded by borders. It is a shared inheritance of every people told that their voices were too loud, too different, too inconvenient. When Jasmine Crockett spoke, she carried not only Dallas, not only Washington, but also echoes of Cape Town, Kingston, and Nairobi. The roots of this moment were centuries deep, and those who watched her that night, elders who had lived through segregation, who had marched in the streets, who had whispered prayers for children in classrooms that never taught their names, recognized it instantly. They knew this was not entertainment. This was inheritance speaking. And so the story begins, not with Jimmy Kimmel's question, but with the weight of history behind Jasmine Crockett's answer. Every journey has a beginning, though it is rarely clear at the time that history is taking its first steps. For Jasmine Crockett, the path toward the halls of Congress and the national spotlight did not begin in the Capitol. It began in the quiet corners of classrooms where she asked questions others were too afraid to ask. It began in the courthouses of Texas, where her voice carried the weight of people who had no one else to defend them. And it began with the realization that to fight for justice, one must first survive the cost of speaking truth. At Prairie View A historically black university with a proud tradition of nurturing leaders, Jasmine sharpened her mind against opponents who underestimated her. She spent weekends in debate tournaments, facing students who came from wealthier families, armed with coaches and teams of researchers. Jasmine had only her preparation, her resilience, and her refusal to be intimidated. Time after time, she found that her weapon was not volume, but precision. A single well-placed argument could undo a carefully built case. She discovered then that power lies not in how loud you speak, but in how deeply your words pierce. While her peers dreamed of corporate careers or lucrative law firms, Jasmine chose another path. She went into public defense, a decision that guaranteed long hours, little money, and endless frustration. But it also guaranteed her proximity to the people who needed her most. She sat across from men who had been in holding cells for weeks simply because they could not afford bail. She listened to women who had lost jobs because they were forced to miss work for court appearances. She saw teenagers whose lives were being defined by a single mistake in a system that had no patience for mercy. In those courtrooms, Jasmine found herself at war not only with prosecutors, but with perception itself. When she objected, she was told she was aggressive. When she raised her voice to defend a client, she was labeled emotional. When she pressed a judge to recognize unfairness, she was called disruptive. Yet Jasmine learned to wear those labels differently. To her, aggressive meant she cared enough to fight. Emotional meant she refused to treat her clients as statistics. Disruptive meant she would not accept silence as compliance. Each insult became confirmation that she was doing something right. Still, the toll was heavy. Nights blurred into mornings as she wrote motions at a kitchen table with a refrigerator that rattled louder than her neighbors. Her pay barely covered rent. Friends encouraged her to leave for more stable work. But Jasmine could not shake the conviction that her voice mattered more in those small, overlooked spaces than it ever could. In a polished office, she understood what many forget. Justice is not abstract. It is the look in a mother's eyes when her child is given a fair hearing. It is the relief in a father's shoulders when he is finally released. After months of waiting, it is the knowledge that dignity does not belong only to those who can afford it. Her reputation grew. Colleagues began to notice that Jasmine was not only skilled, but fearless. She confronted prosecutors who bent the rules, judges who looked the other way, and fellow lawyers who treated clients like burdens. She learned to navigate the traps set for her, not with arrogance, but with preparation so thorough that even her opponents were forced to respect it. It was during these years that Jasmine developed the resilience that would later carry her into politics. But the courtroom was not her only battlefield. Beyond its walls, Jasmine watched as communities in Dallas struggled with crumbling schools, inadequate healthcare, and violence that was too easily dismissed as inevitable. She saw politicians who spoke of reform but delivered only excuses, and she realized that defending her clients, case by case, would never be enough. The system itself was broken, and it would take more than a lawyer to mend it. It would take a legislator. Entering politics was not an easy decision. Jasmine knew what awaited her. Scrutiny harsher than that faced by her peers. Expectations heavier. Patience thinner. Black women in politics were often treated as symbols before they were treated as people. They were dissected, doubted, and dismissed. Yet Jasmine also knew that symbols mattered. If she could carry her community into spaces that had long ignored them, then perhaps the fight would gain new ground. Her first campaigns were not polished productions. They were fueled by neighbors, church members, teachers, and friends. They were powered by shoe leather canvassing and conversations on porches. People saw in Jasmine not perfection, but persistence. They recognized the child who had once asked too many questions, now grown into a woman, determined to demand answers from the people in power. Slowly, her presence in local politics grew. Texas is not a forgiving landscape for a young black woman with progressive convictions. The resistance was fierce. Opponents painted her as radical, unstable, even dangerous. They tried to reduce her campaign to caricature, but Jasmine leaned on the same strategy she had honed in court: calm persistence, unflinching clarity, and the ability to cut through noise with one sentence that mattered. When she finally won her seat, it was not simply a personal victory. It was proof to her community that their voices could not only rise but could be seated at the tables where decisions were made. Jasmine carried with her not just legislation but legacy. Every bill she drafted, every floor speech she delivered, carried echoes of her early years. The nights her mother returned home exhausted from nursing shifts, the days her father fought to keep the shop open, the questions she once asked in classrooms that did not want to answer. This was the beginning of Jasmine Crockett's journey into national consciousness. Not the viral clip, not the late-night confrontation, but the long, unglamorous road of persistence. By the time she stepped into Jimmy Kimmel's studio, she was not a politician searching for validation. She was a woman who had already faced down prosecutors, judges, colleagues, and critics. She had already carried communities on her back. She had already proven that her voice could not be silenced. And so, to the night a joke turned into a reckoning was not the start of Jasmine's story. It was the continuation of a journey that began long before, a journey rooted in struggle, sharpened in courtrooms, tested on campaign trails, and carried into Congress with the weight of history at her side. This was Jasmine Crockett's beginning, a beginning that prepared her for battles yet to come. Late-night television was built on rhythm, smiles, laughter, the quick shuffle of jokes rolling into one another like waves. Jimmy Kimmel had mastered that rhythm for years. He knew how to disarm his guests, how to steer a conversation back to humor when it drifted too far into seriousness. But on the night Jasmine Crockett stepped onto his stage, that rhythm fractured. From the moment she entered, the studio lights seemed sharper, the applause less routine. She walked with a steadiness that belonged more to a courtroom than a comedy stage. The emerald blazer, the unshaken bun, the calmness of her movements. Everything about her presence told the audience that she was not here to play a role written for her. She was here to be herself. And that truth alone shifted the air before a word was spoken. Jimmy began in familiar territory. He teased. He joked. He called her the firecracker from Dallas and the one-woman filibuster machine. The audience laughed, though the laughter carried hesitation, as if unsure whether to join in or to hold back. Jasmine gave a polite smile, but her words cut through the performance. "You can call me Jasmine, but I'm nobody's firecracker." Already, something had changed. The laugh track energy of the crowd had been replaced with curiosity. People leaned in, not just to watch a guest, but to witness a possibility. What would happen if a politician did not bend to the performance of late night? The conversation rolled forward. Jimmy poked fun at Congress, joked about scandals and chaos, and Jasmine answered with grace short, thoughtful, measured. Then came the question he thought would land lightly. You're known for being a little spicy. Is that a strategy, or do you just wake up ready to fight every morning? A ripple of chuckles moved through the audience, but Jasmine did not laugh. She reached for her mug of water, sipped slowly, then placed it back on the table with care. Her voice, steady and calm, cut through the chuckles like glass through fabric. I'll answer that. But let me ask you something first. Do you ever get tired of white men calling you spicy just because you won't let them talk over you? The room stilled, the kind of stillness that arrives, not when a joke fails, but when truth is spoken so plainly that even breath feels like interruption. Eyes widened. A few murmured "ooh" under their breath. And for the first time in the interview, Jimmy Kimmel had no line ready. He blinked. He shifted in his chair. He tapped his cue cards against the desk as though the rhythm of paper might rescue him. But there was no saving line, no quick punch to recover. Jasmine held his gaze with patience, not aggression, not anger. Just the kind of patience born of years, navigating rooms that did not want to hear her truth. Okay, Jimmy stammered, forcing a laugh. I walked into that one. No, Jasmine replied, calm as ever. You ran. The audience gasped, half in awe, half in discomfort. The rhythm of the show was gone. What remained was something raw, unscripted, undeniable. Jimmy tried to reset. He reached for another joke, another line, another card, but Jasmine had already changed the tone. Each time he hinted at caricature, she held up a mirror. Do you ever ask Senator Kennedy that, or is being heated only an issue when it's a woman? She asked, when he pressed about her anger. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was attentive. The entire studio, even those scrolling their phones moments earlier, were now gripped. When he suggested playing a clip of her most heated exchanges, she stopped him, mid-sentence. Don't play a clip of me unless you're playing clips of everybody else losing their temper. Otherwise, you're not showing the truth. You're selling a version. The murmurs turned to claps. Small, at first, hesitant, then spreading like sparks. Jimmy tried to laugh it off, but he knew, everyone knew, the interview had shifted from entertainment to revelation. Jasmine leaned forward, her face framed perfectly for the cameras. Her words, precise and unhurried, landed with the weight of centuries. When you say I'm spicy, what you're really saying is, I don't act like the people you're used to watching on this couch. But maybe that's not my problem. Maybe that's yours. That sentence broke through, not with volume, but with clarity. And in that moment, millions watching from their living rooms, especially elders who had spent lifetimes being told they were too much or too loud, recognized themselves. It was not anger they saw. It was dignity. Refusing to shrink, Jimmy faltered. He smiled nervously, nodded slowly. Fair enough, he said. And the audience understood they had just witnessed something rare, not a performance, not a soundbite, but a moment where truth held the floor and would not yield. From there, the interview staggered on. Jimmy joked about her dog, about her future, even about a Netflix special, but his rhythm was gone. Jasmine remained steady, her composure unshaken, her answers deliberate. When he asked if she wanted to be known as someone who claps back, she replied with a sentence that silenced even his laughter. When you grow up being told to be twice as good and still get talked about like you're twice as difficult, you learn to pick your words. So if I give you one sentence that makes it past the noise, believe me, it's not about being viral. It's about being heard. The words fell like a gavel. The audience did not clap immediately. They sat in reverence, processing, understanding. This was no longer a comedy show. This was testimony. Within hours, the internet was ablaze. A blurry clip from an audience member went viral on Twitter. She didn't even raise her voice. Jasmine Crockett just folded Kimmel in real time, TikTok stitched her line, "Maybe that's not my problem. Maybe that's yours," with dramatic music. On Instagram, celebrities reposted with one word. Captions: "Respect." By morning, it was everywhere. CNN analyzed it. NPR replayed it. ESPN even referenced it. The moment was bigger than the joke, bigger than the show. It had become a cultural turning point, proof that truth, spoken calmly, could cut deeper than any scripted clapback. For Jasmine, it was not victory. For victory's sake, it was survival turned into statement, patience turned into power, history spoken through a single voice. And for those who had spent lifetimes being reduced to caricatures, that night was more than television. It was vindication. The credits rolled, the band played, and the audience filed out into the Hollywood night. But inside the El Capitan Theater, the air had not reset. Jimmy Kimmel sat still in his chair longer than usual, blinking at the desk, as if trying to rewind time. Jasmine Crockett rose with the same calm she carried throughout the interview, thanked the crew politely, and walked off stage. To the audience in the studio, it had been riveting television. To those behind the cameras, it felt like something far larger, something that would not remain contained within those walls. They were right. Within 20 minutes, the internet was already on fire. A shaky phone video posted to Twitter carried the caption, "She didn't even raise her voice." Jasmine Crockett just folded Kimmel in real time. By the time Jasmine's car pulled out of the studio lot, that post had been watched over 300,000 times. The soundbite, "Maybe that's not my problem, maybe that's yours," was clipped, subtitled, and spread like wildfire. On TikTok, users layered dramatic music under the moment, replaying it in slow motion with captions like, "A masterclass in calm power." Reaction videos flooded the platform. People gasping, cheering, even standing in their living rooms as though they too were part of the studio audience. One creator, named Political Baddie, declared, "I've watched this 12 times. The way she didn't blink, didn't flinch. That's the standard." Now, Instagram feeds filled with reposts. Ava DuVernay shared the clip with a single word, "unshakable." Kerry Washington wrote simply, "Respect." Within hours, the moment had slipped from politics into popular culture, crossing the invisible lines that usually keep Washington, Hollywood, and the digital world apart. But the response was not uniform. Conservative commentators seized upon the clip, eager to twist it into a narrative. On talk radio and certain cable networks, voices mocked her. Another angry Democrat woman throwing a tantrum on television. They ignored, of course, the obvious truth. She had not raised her voice, had not insulted, had not shouted. She had been calm, measured, steady. That calmness itself unsettled critics because it left no theatrics to dismiss, no outrage to caricature. She had used their own stage and stripped it of control. Mainstream outlets rushed to cover it. CNN played the moment on repeat. Their analysts debating whether it signaled a cultural shift. NPR featured it in their morning roundup under the headline, "Grace as Resistance." MSNBC invited commentators to discuss what it meant for women in politics, particularly black women, who had for too long been labeled difficult for displaying the same passion that earned men the title strong. Even ESPN's Stephen A. Smith chimed in during his podcast. "Listen, I don't care if you're talking basketball or politics. That was someone taking a verbal elbow to the face and sending it right back without ever leaving the chair." Local stations joined the chorus. In Dallas, morning radio hosts replayed her words with pride. In Detroit, callers to a gospel station compared her calmness to sermons they remembered from childhood, where truth was delivered without shouting, but carried all the more power because of it. Even in small towns like Flagstaff and Bakersfield, her name entered conversations between traffic reports and weather updates. By dawn, major newspapers had picked it up. The Washington Post called it a late-night reckoning. The New York Times described it as a masterclass in restraint. Overseas, the BBC ran a segment titled "The Congresswoman Who Stopped the Laugh Track." What had been one exchange on an American talk show was now global conversation. Yet perhaps the most striking reaction was not in headlines, but in the quiet reverence of ordinary people in group chats. Older Black Americans forwarded the clip to one another with notes like, "That's our daughter, right there." In Facebook comment sections, grandmothers wrote about how many times they themselves had been called spicy or angry when all they did was refuse to be silenced. For them, Jasmine's words were not entertainment. They were recognition inside Jasmine's own team. The phones would not stop ringing. CNN, MSNBC, NPR, even 60 Minutes requested interviews. Her communications director, Andre, stared at the endless notifications, shaking his head. "Do we even respond?" one staffer asked. Jasmine, glancing up from her phone, smiled. "We don't need to, not even a tweet. I already said what I needed to say." That line became its own headline. Jasmine Crockett responds to viral interview. "I already said what I needed to say." For supporters, it was proof of discipline, a refusal to let others drag her into endless spin. For critics, it was infuriating. They could not bait her into more sound bites. She had spoken once, and that was enough. The virality reshaped her image overnight. To some, she was now the congresswoman who silenced Kimmel. To others, she was a cultural figure, proof that dignity could be weaponized without losing its grace. And to her community, the elders, the churchgoers, the activists, she became confirmation that their long fight for respect was not in vain. Jimmy Kimmel himself felt the aftershock. His team released a brief statement, neither apology nor defense. Jimmy appreciates Jasmine Crockett's candor and believes in honest, tough conversations. Some called it weak, others called it mature. But what mattered most was not his recovery. It was that, for once, the late-night stage had been claimed by someone who refused to play along. As the debate raged, the deeper question emerged. Why had one calm sentence struck such a nerve? Why did? Maybe that's not my problem. Maybe that's yours. Echo louder than any shouted argument. The answer lay not just in Jasmine's delivery, but in centuries of silenced voices. She had tapped into something older than television, older than comedy, older even than Congress itself. She had reminded the world that truth, spoken with grace, carries an authority no laughter can drown. And so, what began as a late-night segment became something far greater. It was no longer about Jimmy Kimmel, nor about Jasmine Crockett alone. It had become a mirror held up to a nation, forcing it to ask who gets to speak freely and who gets labeled for doing the same. Who is celebrated for passion and who is reduced to caricature? Who writes the narrative and who reclaims it? By the end of that week, it was clear the interview had ceased to be a piece of entertainment. It had become a national conversation, and conversations, once ignited, cannot easily be contained before the cameras, before Congress. Before late night, America knew her name. Jasmine Crockett was a child in East Dallas. She was the girl who sat at the back of the classroom with her hand raised too often. The girl whose questions lingered longer than the teacher's patience. Why did the school library carry outdated books? Why were there lessons filled with stories of presidents and generals, but so few of women and black leaders? Why, she asked, was silence always demanded from the students who most wanted to speak? Her teachers called her difficult. Some marked her as disruptive, but Jasmine was not trying to disrupt. She was trying to understand. The world had handed her a script that did not fit, and instead of shrinking herself into it, she asked why it had been written that way. Her home life gave her the foundation for that resilience. Her mother worked night shifts as a nurse at Methodist Dallas Medical Center, tending to patients in the long hours. When the city slept, Her father ran a small auto shop that always smelled of oil and iron. His hands calloused from years of labor. They did not have much, just enough to keep the lights on, to put food on the table, to give Jasmine a sense of safety, even when money was thin. What they lacked in wealth, they made up for in belief. Belief that their daughter could stand taller than the limitations placed before her, but safety came with sacrifice. Her parents' long hours meant Jasmine often had to steady herself. She learned early to cook her own meals, to do her homework by the glow of a flickering fridge bulb, to guard her time and her voice. That solitude shaped her. She grew comfortable in silence, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of thought, of sharpening questions before releasing them into a world eager to dismiss. The echoes of history surrounded her. In church basements and community gatherings, she heard the names spoken like scripture. Sojourner Truth, who declared, "Ain't I a woman?" Rosa Parks, who sat so that generations could stand. Shirley Chisholm, who entered Congress, unbought and unbossed. To young Jasmine, these women were not distant icons. They were teachers. They showed her that dignity and defiance could coexist, that calmness could be sharper than any blade, that a single sentence could carry centuries of weight. At Prairie View A.M. University, she found her proving ground. The debate halls became arenas where she stood against students with sharper suits and deeper pockets, but never sharper words. She worked the campus help desk to pay her bills, answering calls about broken printers by day and dismantling arguments by night. What she lacked in polish, she made up for in persistence. Judges in those halls began to notice she never shouted, never rattled. She waited, she listened. She delivered lines that landed not like punches, but like verdicts. Law school refined those instincts. There, she discovered the raw face of injustice. As a public defender, she sat across from mothers begging for help in courtrooms that treated them as afterthoughts. She stood beside young men who had been written off before their cases were even heard. She learned the art of survival in spaces that expected her to bend, to smile more, to soften her tone, to wear invisibility like armor. Each time, she refused. Someone labeled her aggressive, too passionate, too much. And each time, she stored those words like receipts. She did not rage. She documented every dismissal, every coded critique, every sideways glance. They became the bricks that built her composure. By the time she entered politics, she knew what awaited her. The same labels repackaged, the same dismissals rehearsed, but she also knew how to respond, not with fire that burned out, but with fire that glowed steady, controlled, unyielding. This was the soil that grew the Jasmine who sat before Jimmy Kimmel that night. When he called her spicy, it was not the first time, not the 10th, not even the 100th. It was the echo of a lifetime of voices who had tried to shrink her into something small enough to dismiss. But unlike those moments in childhood classrooms or weary courtrooms, this time the stage was lit for millions. This time, her refusal to bend was not just personal, it was public, collective, historical. She carried East Dallas with her. She carried her mother's weary hands and her father's oil-stained palms. She carried the voices of women who had been told to soften, but instead chose to stand. She carried every courtroom where she had been told she was too much, every classroom where her questions were unwelcome. And when she said, "Maybe that's not my problem, maybe that's yours," it was not only Jasmine Crockett speaking, it was every generation that had raised her. Every ancestor who had fought before microphones and cameras were even options for those watching, especially elders who had walked their own paths through silence and dismissal. Her composure felt familiar. They recognized the look in her eyes, the patience in her tone. It was the same look they had carried into workplaces, into schools, into city halls, where they were told they did not belong. And in that recognition, they felt not just pride, but vindication. Jasmine Crockett did not emerge fully formed from the fire of a single moment. She was forged in the steady heat of years of questions, of dismissals, of persistence. She was not just a politician who clapped back on live television. She was the daughter of workers, the student of history, the lawyer of the overlooked. She was a vessel carrying not only her own story, but the story of a people who had long been told to sit down and be quiet. That is why the clip reverberated. That is why silence fell so heavily in the studio. That is why millions shared it, debated it, replayed it. It was not simply Jasmine Crockett on stage, it was the long line of women before her, standing with her, speaking through her. And so, when history writes of that night, it will not begin with Jimmy Kimmel's joke. It will begin in a Dallas classroom, where a young girl refused to stop asking questions. It will begin with a mother on a night shift and a father in an auto shop. It will begin with a family that taught her to stand tall, even when the world wanted her small, for no one arrives on stage alone. And Jasmine Crockett's calm that night was not isolation, it was inheritance. When the cameras cut to commercial, the studio did what it always did, shifted into its efficient machine. Crew members adjusted cables, producers whispered into headsets, stage managers ushered audience members toward the exit. But that night, there was something unusual in the air. The laughter had died too quickly, the applause had felt too restrained, and Jimmy Kimmel sat behind his desk longer than usual, shuffling note cards that no longer carried weight. In the control room, producers exchanged glances. Some smirked nervously, others frowned. One young staffer whispered, "We're trending already." But no one wanted to say the obvious, that the guest had just outshone the host, not with comedy, but with candor. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, left the stage. As she had entered it steady, composed, deliberate, she did not linger for congratulations. She did not rush either. She walked through the hallway with her emerald blazer still sharp under the fluorescent lights, as if the performance had not happened at all. To her, it had not been a performance. It had been a conversation, one she had been preparing for her entire life. Behind her, Jimmy leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the desk. He chuckled weakly, but it was not amusement. It was the nervous laugh of a man replaying his own words in his head, recognizing how easily they had unraveled before a woman who refused to play along. That was the first aftershock, but the second came days later, away from cameras, away from the manufactured laughter of a live studio audience. It happened in a quiet hallway at the El Capitan Theater. Jasmine had returned not for another interview, but for a meeting with one of the producers about a community initiative. She was spearheading bringing media literacy programs into underserved schools. She was not expecting to see Jimmy, yet as fate often arranges, their paths crossed near the dressing rooms. He saw her first. For a moment he hesitated, as though considering whether to walk away, but then he stepped forward. His voice was quieter than the one America knew. "Hey!" Jasmine looked up, present, but unstartled. "Hey!" There was a pause, not tense, not awkward, just human. Jimmy's eyes searched hers, as if measuring how much truth the space could hold without a camera watching. "I've been thinking about what you said," he admitted. "That night, about being called spicy, I think I got too comfortable. Forgot that being funny doesn't excuse being careless." Jasmine tilted her head, studying him. She did not rush her response. "You're not the first," she said softly, "and you won't be the last." "I know," Jimmy replied. His shoulders sagged just slightly, as if shedding a weight. "But I don't want to be either of those things." For the first time, the grin that so often masked him was gone. In its place was something raw, something rare. Sincerity. Then Jasmine gave the kind of answer that only someone who has carried dignity like armor could give. "Then don't be." Jimmy exhaled. He laughed. But this time, the laugh was real, lighter, almost grateful. "Thank you," he said, "for not torching me out there." Jasmine smirked, a flicker of humor crossing her calm face. "I don't torch," she replied. "I clarify." That exchange lasted less than 2 minutes. No applause, no dramatic music, no trending hashtags, but in its simplicity, it carried a weight that no viral clip could match. It was a moment, stripped bare of performance. Two people, one known for jokes and the other for justice, meeting in the middle without armor, without script, without audience. The truth is, growth does not always arrive under the spotlight. Sometimes it arrives in quiet hallways, in conversations. No one records, in admissions, whispered more than declared. That was the kind of growth that unfolded between Jimmy Kimmel and Jasmine Crockett. Days later, Jasmine gave a talk at a high school in Tulsa. A student, bold and wide-eyed, raised her hand and asked, "How do you stay calm when people try to make you small?" Jasmine did not hesitate. "You don't give them the power to define you," she said, "and you remember there is nothing louder than grace." The room fell silent. Teachers scribbled the words onto notepads. A few students mouthed them quietly to themselves, as if storing them away for a future moment, when they too would be asked to shrink. That line would never trend like a viral video. It would not appear on TikTok with dramatic edits, but it would live on bulletin boards, in the corners of classrooms, in the memories of young people who understood that survival sometimes means carrying your truth with calm certainty, and that is the essence of Jasmine Crockett's story. The world may remember her for a single sentence on a late-night show, but those who look closer will see that her power is not measured in sound bites. It is measured in the grace she carries into spaces designed to reduce her. It is measured in the way she corrects without humiliating, clarifies without torching, teaches without preaching. The cameras captured one kind of moment. The hallway revealed another. One belonged to entertainment, the other to humanity. Both mattered. But only one would truly last. Because history is not only written in applause or headlines. Sometimes it is written in quiet exchanges where two people decide, without witnesses, to do better. And if Jasmine Crockett's story teaches us anything, it is that the most powerful revolutions are often the ones that unfold when nobody is watching. In the end, the story of Jasmine Crockett is not just about one night on a late-night show. It is not only about Jimmy Kimmel's stumble or a viral clip that set the internet ablaze. It is about something larger, something deeper. It is about the long road from a Dallas classroom, where a young girl refused to stop asking questions, to a stage in Hollywood, where she refused to shrink beneath a careless joke. What millions witnessed that evening was not improvisation. It was inheritance. Jasmine Crockett carried with her the voices of women who had been told to soften, the resilience of workers who labored without recognition, and the fire of a community that had been tested generation after generation. Her calm was not silence. It was strength. Her words were not rehearsed. They were remembered, carried from the lips of ancestors who had taught her that dignity is not negotiable. When she said, "Maybe that's not my problem. Maybe that's yours," she was not speaking only for herself. She was speaking for every woman who has ever been reduced to a label, for every black voice in Congress that has ever been called too loud, too angry, or too much, for every young person told to lower their hand, to dim their light, to wait their turn. In that moment, she held the weight of their silences and transformed it into clarity. That is why the clip spread across timelines and television screens. That is why people leaned forward, why they replayed her words, not as entertainment, but as revelation. It was not about spectacle. It was about truth. And truth, delivered with grace, is louder than any applause. The legacy of Jasmine Crockett is still being written. Today she is a congresswoman. Tomorrow, perhaps something more. But her true contribution will not be measured in titles. It will be measured in the courage she gives to others. The way her calm defiance echoes in classrooms, in workplaces, in family living rooms. It will be measured in the way people remember that one sentence, that one pause, that one refusal to let someone else's words define her. History often crowns its heroes in moments of fire marches, protests, speeches that rattle the air. But sometimes History chooses quieter revolutions. Sometimes it is a woman seated calmly under studio lights, refusing to laugh at her own diminishment. Sometimes it is the grace to correct without fury, the patience to hold silence until the truth has room to stand. That is what Jasmine Crockett offered. Not a performance, not a viral stunt, but a reminder that you do not have to raise your voice to be heard. You do not have to fight dirty to win respect. You do not have to bend yourself into someone else's mold to deserve dignity. And so the story does not end here. It continues in every listener who felt that pause, in every viewer who saw themselves reflected in her steadiness, in every person who whispers to themselves, "I don't have to shrink to be seen," because her words were not a closing statement. They were an invitation to live with clarity, to speak with truth, to carry grace into spaces where the world expects you to bend. If you felt something in this story, if you paused, if you reflected, if you recognize yourself in Jasmine Crockett's journey, then do not keep it to yourself. Share it, speak it, carry it forward. For stories like these are not mere entertainment, they are reminders. And reminders, when spoken aloud, can become revolutions. So, let us end where she began. Not with laughter, not with labels, but with clarity. Growth starts at discomfort. Change begins at truth. And nothing is louder than grace.